I'd replayed that long-awaited homecoming in my head for over 20 years, but I never expected the front door to shut right in my face. The crisp autumn air carried the sharp scent of burning firewood and dry leaves as I stepped out of the taxi. I adjusted the duffel bag over my shoulder, clutching a small gift box filled with simple souvenirs I had brought from overseas. My heart pounded as I walked up the cracked stone walkway toward my childhood home in rural Pennsylvania. I hesitated on the porch for just a second, vividly remembering how I stood in that exact spot as a 10-year-old child, holding my second-place ribbon while my parents showered my sister with praise for winning first prize. Before I could knock, the door opened slightly and my sister Chloe stood there, staring at me like I was a ghost. She blinked in disbelief, barely able to speak my name as I offered a hesitant smile. She stepped aside without a hug, directing me toward the kitchen where my parents were casually preparing food. My mother barely looked up from chopping apples on the counter, while my father took a slow sip of coffee and stared at my worn military fatigues. The silence in the room stretched far longer than it should have, feeling colder than any military deployment I had ever survived. When I asked where my classic car was parked, my father calmly announced that he had sold it last year because they needed the extra garage space. I felt a knot form in my throat as I realized they had disposed of my property without even sending a single text message. My father stood up, crossed his arms, and reminded me that I had chosen a life of military discipline over family, so I had no right to complain about how they managed things. He looked me dead in the eye and suggested that if I did not like the way things were, I should head back to the barracks where I belonged. Not a single person in that room stepped in to defend me, so I turned around and walked out into the pouring rain. With nowhere else to go, I checked into a local military transitional housing facility, dropping my heavy duffel bag on the thin mattress of room 207. While eating a simple dinner in the mess hall, I ran into an old comrade named Caleb, who mentioned that the president was preparing to present a high-level national honor to an unnamed veteran. Later that evening, an encrypted email arrived from the Pentagon confirming that I had been selected for a top-secret presidential commendation to be broadcast live on national television. Over the next few days, I kept the news completely to myself, watching military personnel conduct morning drills outside my window, while my family remained entirely oblivious. Across town, my family sat in their comfortable living room complaining about political news on television, completely unaware that the daughter they had cast aside was about to step onto the biggest stage in the country. They viewed the military as a pointless endeavor, completely blind to the sacrifices I had made while serving overseas for 2 full decades. On the morning of the ceremony, I put on my tailored dress uniform, carefully pinning every single medal I had earned across my chest. As I stood backstage at the White House, my heart raced, but I drew strength from the years of hardship I had quietly overcome. When the president stepped up to the podium and officially announced my full name and rank to the entire world, the room erupted into thunderous applause as millions tuned in live from home. In that exact moment, my family sat watching the broadcast in utter shock as my mother dropped her glass onto the rug and my father stared at the screen in disbelief. The very person they had dismissed as a failure was being awarded the highest honors by the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. Camera flashes illuminated the stage as the president pinned the distinguished award onto my lapel, solidifying a moment of absolute vindication that no one could ever strip away from me. Within hours of the live broadcast, my phone was overwhelmed with hundreds of missed calls, text messages, and voicemails from relatives who had ignored me for decades. My sister reached out begging to meet, so I agreed to sit down with her at a quiet cafe just outside the military installation. She sat across from me in plain clothes, crying quietly as she admitted that the family had treated me like a ghost simply because they could not understand the path I had chosen. A few days later, my father showed up at the security gates of the base, standing nervously as he tried to offer an awkward apology for turning his back on me. He confessed that he was proud of my achievements, asking if there was any chance we could start over from scratch. I looked him in the eye and calmly explained that while I no longer carried anger toward him, I was no longer willing to shrink myself just to fit into their dynamic. During my keynote address at the National Defense Summit, I stood in front of hundreds of senior officials and spoke openly about resilience, self-worth, and overcoming abandonment. I declared to the crowd that true family is not defined by blood, but by those who stand by your side when the world turns its back on you. The standing ovation that followed served as a powerful reminder that my worth was defined by my actions, not by the approval of people who failed to see my value. When I eventually returned to my family home for a final dinner, the atmosphere was thick with awkward attempts at small talk and unearned familiarity. My father tried to raise a toast to forgiveness and moving forward, but I set my glass down and made it clear that peace did not mean returning to the past. I stood up from the table, thanked them for the meal, and walked out the front door for the very last time, leaving their quiet household behind forever. Back at my peaceful lakeside cabin, I sat at my wooden desk and carefully composed handwritten letters to the comrades who had supported me throughout my journey. I took the unopened letter my father had sent weeks ago, carried it outside into the fresh morning air, and set it ablaze with a single match. As the ashes drifted away into the gentle breeze, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom wash over my entire body. I stepped back inside, adjusted the collar of my uniform in the mirror, and smiled at the strong, resilient woman looking back at me. They had erased my presence from the family home, but my name was now etched permanently into the history of our nation. I realized that true justice does not always scream for attention, but rather waits patiently to demonstrate that a person who knows their own worth can never be diminished by silence.